The sky was the color of old brass, dulled by years of wind and dust, and the land beneath it seemed to breathe in slow, heavy sighs. A lone rider cut across the horizon, his silhouette bending and straightening with the gait of a lean, trail-worn bay. His name was known in whispers along the frontier, though most who spoke it had never seen his face. Those who had remembered the eyes, gray like weathered iron, unblinking, carrying the weight of too many graves. He was a scout by trade, but not the eager kind who chased bounties or glory. His work was survival, measured in quiet miles in the spaces between gunshots. He had been hired by a rancher whose wealth seemed to grow with every mile the settlers pushed west. The task was simple enough on paper. Guide the supply caravan to the sprawling estate that would soon be the rancher's newest crown. The truth sat heavier in his gut. The route carved through land sacred to people, and no deal struck in some dimly lit parlor could erase that fact. He knew what that meant. Tension in every shadow, the possibility that the land itself might reject the intrusion. The wind changed as the caravan crawled through a narrow pass, carrying the faint sweetness of wild sage and the sharper edge of danger. He slowed his horse, scanning the ridges. A flicker of movement, a shadow peeling from stone, caught his eye. She stood above them, framed by the dying light, her bow drawn, the arrowhead glinting like a shard of night. Her hair, braided and bound with rawhide, shifted with the wind. Her stance was unyielding. Her gaze locked on him as if she'd been expecting him for years. He raised his rifle, not with haste, but with the slow precision of a man who understood what the first move could cost. The air between them tightened, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The rancher's men muttered, fingers twitching near their holsters, but he didn't look at them. The world narrowed to the line between her eyes and his barrel, a standoff measured in heartbeats. Then, with a motion so subtle it almost didn't register, she tilted her bow toward the sky and loosed the arrow high. It whistled through the wind before vanishing into the darkening clouds. A warning, not a kill. She spoke in her own tongue, sharp, rhythmic, like stone over water. The words were meant for him, though he understood only fragments from his years in the borderlands. Danger comes. Turn back. Her voice held no plea, only the certainty of someone who had seen enough blood to know its scent before it spilled. That night, while the caravan circled their wagon for safety, he slipped away under the guise of checking the trail ahead. He found her near a dry creek bed, crouched by the ashes of a small fire. The moonlight softened the edges of her face, but the tension in her shoulders spoke of readiness. She didn't raise her bow this time. They spoke in half-words and gestures, filling the gaps with the language of survival, pointing to the stars for direction, tracing lines in the dirt for distances. She told him her name, Ahiona. He said his only once. She didn't repeat it, but he sensed she would remember. In the stillness between their sentences, the land spoke for them. The rustle of dry grass, the distant cry of a night bird, the steady pulse of the earth under their boots. She warned him that the rancher's path would bring more than wagons. It would bring war. He didn't tell her she was right. He didn't have to. The truth lay in the silence between them. Days passed in a rhythm of slow progress and quiet tension. The men grumbled about the heat, the dust, the constant watchfulness of eyes they could not see. He rode ahead often, using the excuse of scouting to search for her shadow on the ridges. Sometimes he found her. Sometimes he only found the faint imprint of her boots in the dust, a sign she had been there and moved on. One evening, near the edge of a canyon where the wind howled like a living thing, they met again. She led him to a place where the rock opened to reveal a hidden spring, its water clear and cold. As he drank, she spoke of her people, their fields turned to dust by drought, their hunting grounds shrinking under the press of strangers. Her voice carried no bitterness, only the weight of inevitability. He told her, in his way, about the war he'd fought in years before, how he'd thought sides were clear until he saw the bodies of boys too young to shave lying in the mud, their eyes wide to the sky. She didn't answer, but her gaze lingered on him a moment longer than before, as if measuring the truth in him. When they parted, the sun was sinking low, staining the canyon walls in blood and gold. She touched his arm lightly, not in affection, but as if to mark him, to remind him that he was now part of something he could not walk away from. That night, as the campfires burned low and the men drifted into uneasy sleep, he lay awake listening to the wind. There was a smell in it, smoke, faint but certain. He rose quietly, stepping beyond the ring of light, and looked toward the distant hills. On the horizon, a thin column of black curled into the sky, a signal or a warning. He could not yet tell, but deep down, he knew it was the beginning of something that would not end without blood. And somewhere out there, in the dark between the ridges, she was watching the same smoke rise. Rain came sudden and hard, hammering the plains as if the sky had cracked wide open. The caravan stumbled into a shallow canyon for shelter, its walls darkened by the downpour. The air smelled of wet stone and juniper. The scout led his bay into the cover of an overhang, water streaming from his hat brim. Clothes heavy with cold. In the flicker of a torch, a shadow moved. Ahiona, stepping from behind a jut of rock, her bow slung but close at hand. Her hair clung to her cheeks, and droplets ran along the lines of her jaw. They said nothing for a long moment. The storm filled the silence with its hiss and roar, and the only light was a wavering fire between them. She crouched, resting her hands on her knees, her eyes locked on him as if weighing his place in her story. He sat opposite her, the wet leather of his coat creaking faintly when he moved. She asked about the smoke he had seen days ago. Her words measured. He told her it was from settlers farther east, clearing land for planting. Her lips pressed tight, though her voice remained calm. She spoke of the fields her people had lost, of streams now muddied and shallow where children once fished. The bitterness in her tone was a thin blade, under control. He wanted to tell her she was right, that the land was shrinking not from drought alone, but from men like the ones he rode with. Instead, he said nothing, letting the rain speak for him. When the storm eased, she led him up a narrow path carved into the rock. At the top, the horizon stretched in every direction, green patches of grassland, dry gullies, and distant ridges. She pointed toward the far hills, explaining that her sister lived there, tending the sick and wounded. Sani, she said, the name soft on her tongue. She believes peace can still be made. He asked if she believed the same. Her eyes lingered on the dark line of wagons in the canyon below. Peace is for those who can afford to wait. By the time he returned to camp, the men were restless. Supplies were running light, and the ranchers' patience thinner still. Around the fire, the rancher's foreman spoke too freely, his voice carrying in the night. The scout, sitting in the shadows, listened as they spoke of moving faster. Not to beat the weather, but to stake their claim before the tribe could gather to resist. Words like clear them out and make an example settled into his ears like grit he couldn't spit out. He slept little, turning over the choice that pressed against his ribs. If he warned Ahiona, he would betray the men paying him. If he stayed silent, her people might die. Dawn broke with a decision still unmade. 2 days later, he scouted ahead to a stretch of dry prairie where the wind pushed long waves through the grass. He expected to find Ahiona waiting on some ridge, but instead saw a younger woman, her hair shorter, her build slighter, though the shape of her eyes made the relation clear. She carried a bundle wrapped in doeskin and walked with careful steps, as if the land itself were listening. Sani, she introduced herself, glancing toward the caravan that trailed far behind. She carried a message. Ahiona had gone to intercept a group of settlers crossing from the north, hoping to slow them before they reached the estate. Sani said her sister wanted the scout to keep riding, not to follow. There was something in the way she said it, tight, urgent, that told him danger was already near. That night the air grew thick and still, the kind of silence that makes the skin feel too tight. From his bedroll, he saw a faint glow on the northern horizon, pulsing like a heartbeat. At first he thought it was a reflection of the sunset lingering too long, but then came the faint, low crack of gunfire. He rose quietly, saddling the bay while the rest of the camp dozed. He rode until the glow became flames, the smell of burning pitch and canvas drifting on the wind. The flicker of fire revealed scattered wagons, some overturned, others blackening in the heat. Shadows moved between them, men and women in war paint, their shouts sharp against the crackle of the blaze. He searched the chaos for her, for Braid he knew so well, but the smoke blurred everything into shifting shapes. A rifle cracked close by, the bullet kicking dust from the ground near his boot. He wheeled the bay away, heart hammering, and cut back across the prairie toward the caravan. The fire's glow faded behind him, but its heat lingered in his chest. He told himself she was alive. He had to believe that. When he returned, the camp was stirring, drawn by the distant light. The rancher's men whispered about the attack. How bold it was, how it meant the tribe was growing desperate. The foreman grinned at the thought of retaliation. The scout kept his mouth shut, his eyes on the dark beyond the firelight, where he imagined her slipping through the grass, bow in hand, smoke on her skin. Sleep never came. The prairie wind had changed again, carrying the faintest trace of rain, and somewhere far off, a coyote called into the night. It sounded like a warning. The rain followed him to the estate, turning the road into black mud that clung to the horse's hooves and slowed every step. Lanterns glowed faintly ahead, marking the rancher's sprawling claim, a high fence of split rail and barbed wire, the main house rising from the gloom like a dark ship in a storm. The scout rode through the open gate, hat pulled low, coat heavy with wet. The place smelled of horses, smoke, and fresh-cut timber, a scent that spoke of both new beginnings and the ruin that made them possible. Men moved about the yard, unloading crates, checking tack, barking orders. None spared him more than a glance. His kind belonged here only when needed. He dismounted and led the bay toward the stables, feeling the weight of fatigue in his bones. The foreman approached, nodding once before gesturing toward the main porch. "Boss wants you inside." "Now!" The warmth inside hit him like a wall, oil lamps flickering against polished wood, the faint perfume of cigars and cooked meat lingering in the air. The rancher sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, his broad frame silhouetted against the flames. Beside him, speaking quietly with one of the women from the kitchen, stood someone the scout recognized, though not in the way he had expected. It was Sonny. Her hair was no longer tied with rawhide, but left loose over her shoulders, a modest calico dress replacing the leathers she had worn when they first met. Her posture was careful, her face composed, but her eyes flicked toward her with a look that carried more weight than words could manage. The rancher rose, spreading his hands in a gesture that was meant to seem welcoming but felt like a trap. "Scout," he said, "this is Sonny. She's agreed to stay here as a friend to peace between our people." Sonny inclined her head slightly. The expression she wore was the same one a wolf might hold while surrounded by hounds. Still, watchful, ready to move if the circle closed. He forced his face to remain neutral, giving only a brief nod in return. Later, when the house quieted and the lamps burned low, he found her alone on the back porch. The air was damp with the promise of more rain, and the distant hills were little more than shapes against the clouded sky. They stood apart at first, the space between them filled with things neither was ready to say. "She told me to come here," Sonny said finally, her voice low. His hand tightened on the railing. "Ahiona." "She's alive," Sonny confirmed, "but not free." She glanced toward the darkened barn, where the rancher kept the horses. "They hold her close, not in chains you can see, but in chains all the same. They'll use her to keep me here, to keep both of us quiet." He studied her in the dim light, noting the strain in her face. This was no voluntary stay. She was playing a part, one wrong move from losing everything. "Why tell me?" "Because you owe her," Sonny said simply, "and because I can't do this alone." The following days unfolded under a veneer of civility. The rancher hosted dinners for his men and visiting land agents, all under the guise of building alliances. Sonny was always present, seated near the head of the table, listening more than speaking. The scout watched her carefully, noting how her gaze would linger on certain maps, how she would slip away when conversations turned toward troop movements or new settlements. Each night, they met briefly in the shadows beyond the lamplight. She fed him fragments of what she learned, a shipment of weapons hidden in the grain store, extra guards posted near the southern fence, a locked cabin no one entered but the rancher. On the third night, she pressed something into his hand, a small braid, the end bound in a strip of red cloth. He knew it before he even looked. "Ahiona's." His jaw clenched. "Where?" "In the barn," she whispered. "Not where they keep the horses. The far stall behind the feed crates. Be careful. The guards are restless." The opportunity came after midnight, when the estate slept under a shroud of fog. He crossed the yard, keeping low, the damp air muffling his steps. The barn loomed ahead, its wide doors pulled shut but unbarred. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of hay and oil. Lantern light spilled weakly from the far end, where a lone guard sat hunched over a deck of cards, muttering to himself. The scout moved silently along the shadows, slipping behind stack bales until he reached the far stall. The feed crates stood where Sonny had said. He shifted them aside, revealing a small wooden chest. Its lid was unlocked, and inside lay a few personal items: a beaded pouch, a strip of cloth, and the braid now missing from Sonny's possession. The braid's cut-in was rough, the hair dark, and still smelling faintly of wood smoke. He was reaching for the pouch when a shadow passed over him. The guard's voice cut the silence. "Lose something, Scout?" The rifle barrel pressed into his side was steady. The scout straightened slowly, letting his hands show. The guard's expression held no malice, only curiosity, the kind that could turn dangerous in a heartbeat. "Just checking the feed," he said evenly. The guard's eyes narrowed, then flicked toward the chest. "Boss keeps his own feed in there, does he?" Before the scout could answer, a second voice came from the barn door. Smooth, confident, unmistakable. "The rancher. Step away from there." The guard obeyed, lowering the rifle slightly but keeping his stance ready. The rancher approached, his boots crunching softly over the straw. His gaze moved from the chest of the scout's face, reading the truth in the space of a breath. "You've been here before," the rancher said quietly. "Not the barn. Here, between my men and theirs. You think you can walk that line without falling." The scout said nothing. The rancher's smile was thin and cold. "Be careful, Scout. Some lines aren't meant to be crossed twice." The rancher turned and left without another word, the guard trailing after him. The scout stood in the dim lantern light for a moment longer, the braid still heavy in his hand, the air thick with the knowledge that time was running out. When he returned to the porch, Sonny was waiting, her hands gripping the railing. He placed the braid in her palm. She closed her fingers around it, her face unreadable. "They know," he said. "Then we have to move," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear that edged it. Somewhere beyond the fence, the hills lay shrouded in mist, and in one of the locked cabins, Iona waited. The night felt too still, as if the land itself were bracing for what was coming. Fog clung to ground like a low tide, curling between fence posts and drifting over the pasture grass. The scout moved through it with measured steps, his coat pulled tight, his breath a faint plume in the cold. Somewhere behind him, a door closed softly, the signal that Sonny had slipped free from a house. She joined him without a word, her hair hidden under a scarf, the faint gleam of a knife at her belt. "They'll change the guard of the grain store in a quarter hour," she said, her voice low but urgent. "We light it, they'll all come running." "And Iona?" Sonny's eyes flicked toward the row of outbuildings beyond the corral. "Locked in the cabin near the water tower. One guard inside, one outside. If you're fast—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The estate was still asleep in the gray pre-dawn, only a few lamps burning in the bunkhouse. They moved through the fog like wraiths, keeping to the shadows of wagons and sheds. When they reached the grain store, Sonny knelt by the door, pulling a small oil flask from her coat. Her hands worked quickly, scattering the liquid across sacks stacked to the rafters. The scent of kerosene mixed with the damp air, sharp and dangerous. He struck the match. The flame took with a low hiss, licking up the edge of the nearest sack before climbing hungrily higher. They slipped out the side door, the fire's glow already beginning to pulse against the fog. By the time they reached the water tower, shouts rang across the yard. Men spilled from the bunkhouse, rifles in hand, some running toward the fire, others shouting orders no one stopped to follow. The confusion was their only cover. The guard outside the cabin turned toward the blaze, his back briefly exposed. The scout crossed the distance in 3 strides, the butt of his rifle catching the man behind the ear. The body crumpled into the mud without a sound. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and unwashed blankets. Iona sat against the far wall, her wrists bound, her face pale, but her eyes still burning. She did not look surprised to see him, only weary, as if she had known he would come but doubted it would matter. He cut her free. She stood slowly, her muscles stiff, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Her gaze shifted to Sonny in the doorway, and something unspoken passed between the sisters. Relief, warning, the weight of unfinished things. They stepped out into the fog just as another voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. The rancher strode toward them, his coat open, one hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. His face was calm, but his eyes were locked on the scout. "You've picked your side, then," he said. The scout didn't answer. The fire's glow reflected in the rancher's eyes, and for a heartbeat the world felt balanced on the thin edge of a blade. "You think you can walk out of here with both of them?" The rancher's tone was almost conversational. "Maybe you can, but I promise you, when you ride off, you're riding into a life that ends in a rope or a bullet." The scout lifted his rifle, steady. "Maybe, but I've already seen what staying here looks like." The rancher's gaze shifted briefly to Iona, then to Sonny, before settling back on him. "You shoot me, they'll never stop hunting you. Then I won't kill you." The rifle barrel didn't waver. "But you'll carry the mark of what happened here. Your men will know you were beaten." The rancher's jaw tightened. For a moment it seemed he might draw, but instead he took a slow step back, his hand falling away from the pistol. "Go," he said finally. They moved quickly, slipping through the fog toward the outer fence. The fire had grown wild behind them, its smoke mingling with the low clouds, swallowing the shouts and curses of men trying to save the grain. Horses stamped nervously in their pens as the three approached. He swung into the saddle first, then pulled Iona up behind him. Sonny mounted her own horse, her face set toward the hills. They didn't speak as they rode. The only sound the thud of hooves in the soft earth and the low groan of wind through the grass. The fog began to thin as they reached the open prairie. Behind them, the estate was half lost in the smoke, its sharp lines blurred, the fire still burning like a second sun. Iona's arms tightened around him, not in fear but in the quiet acknowledgement of what had been taken back. They rode until the sun broke over the ridges, turning the wet grass to gold. In the new light, the land seemed endless again, unscarred by fences or gates. But the scout knew the illusion would fade. The rancher would heal his pride and send riders. The war over the land would not end here. Still, for this moment, they had won. The sisters rode side by side, the space between them filled not with words, but with the unshakable knowledge that they had survived together. He looked back once, the smoke a dark smudge against the morning sky. Some battles, he thought, left scars on the land. Others left them on the soul. Ahead, the prairie stretched into the horizon, and somewhere within it lay a place where they might rest, if only for a while.